Okay, well, we continue working our way through Calvin's Tracts and Letters. This is Volume 1, Part 3. And we continue with Theodore Beza's biographical account of his predecessor, Calvin, there in Geneva. And we'll pick up on page 48. Calvin had, moreover, this same year a double cause of anxiety, both at home and abroad. An individual, old in wickedness, though still young in years, having returned to Geneva, his native place, after he had for some time counterfeited the hermit in France, began with making a great profession of piety. Calvin, who was a sagacious and skillful judge of character, if ever any man was, soon saw through him, and began to admonish him, gently at first, but by and by more freely, and after he had given himself a great many airs before the congregation, to rebuke him openly. He, enraged at this, easily finds out persons against whose iniquities Calvin had been wont to inveigh, and who were quite ready to assist him with their influence and their zeal. Accordingly, when it became necessary to supply a vacancy in the pastoral office caused by the death of a pastor, he, with his adherents, openly intrigued for it. But why enter more into detail? The Senate, interposing its authority, orders him to be taken on trial. Calvin, with his colleagues, resisted, and showing how repugnant his intriguing for the office was to the word of God, succeeded in obtaining the concurrence of the Senate to maintain the ecclesiastical laws as they had been enacted. At this time also there were some persons in France who, having fallen away at first from fear of persecution, had afterwards begun to be so satisfied with their conduct as to deny that there was any sin in giving bodily attendance on popish rites, provided their minds were devoted to true religion. This most pernicious error, which had been condemned of old by the fathers, Calvin refuted with the greatest clearness, though, as they alleged, with too much severity, adding the opinions of the most learned theologians, Philip Melanchthon, Bucer, Peter Martyr, and the Church of Zurich. The consequence was that from that time on, the name of Nicodemite was held in detestation by all good men. The name of Nicodemite was applied to those who pretended to find a sanction for their misconduct in the example of that most holy man, Nicodemus. The succeeding year, that's 1546, was in no respect milder than its predecessor. For while it was necessary to confirm the minds of the citizens against frequent rumors of preparations which the emperor was said to be making against religion, and against the wiles of the Pope, who was said to have incendiaries in his pay, the state of the city was particularly deplorable in this respect, that the petulance of the wicked, so far from being tamed by the many chastisements they had received, on the contrary, continued to increase, and at length broke out openly. For they had obtained for their leader one Ami Perrin. It's A-M-I. I don't think that's pronounced Amy, so we'll say Ami. An exceedingly foolish person, but daring and ambitious, whom for this reason Calvin in his letters nicknamed the Comic Caesar, and who some time before had succeeded in getting the people to vote him into the office of Capital General, thinking as he well might that himself and those like himself could have no footing while the laws were in vigor, and especially while Calvin was constantly thundering against their licentiousness. He began at length in this year openly to show what he and his faction were meditating. This being at once rebuked and repressed by the authority of the Senate, he became silent, indeed, but in a manner which more clearly betrayed his dishonesty. For a short time after, at a pretty full meeting of the Senate, one of the members, secretly instigated, it is supposed, by two ministers of the consistory, both of them given to drunkenness, and not less afraid than others of the rigor of the law, accuses Calvin of preaching false doctrine. But Calvin gave himself no trouble with these barking dogs, who was, however, put upon his trial, and after due investigation, convicted of calumny. The two false pastors in league with him were deposed, and even the tippling houses were interdicted. I don't know what a tippling house is. Sounds bad, though. So far were these bad men from succeeding in their malice, but the fire which had suppressed this year blazed forth, and which succeeded, that is, 1547. Nor did any year of that age prove more calamitous. The churches of Germany were reduced to such extremity that some of the princes and cities surrendered voluntarily, and others of them were taken by force, so that the structure which had been reared in the course of so many years, after so great exertions, seemed to be in one moment overthrown. Those were generally considered most happy who, by an opportune death, had been delivered from these disasters. In this calamitous condition of the churches, we may easily suppose how that pious breast was tormented, which, even when in the enjoyment of peace itself, felt as much for the remotest churches as if the whole burden of them had been entrusted to its care. How could it be otherwise? What pain must he have felt when he saw the most distinguished men, his dear friends, Melanchthon, Bucer, Martyr, in such peril that they were more in death than in life. But that strong mind of Calvin rose above these storms, is both attested by his writings and was also proved by his conduct. At home, when vexed to the utmost by the wicked, he did not turn from his course so much as a hairbreadth. To return to domestic strife, his sole object being to show that the gospel which he preached did not consist in mere speculation, but in Christian practice. He, of course, experienced the hostility of those who had declared war against all piety, and in short, against their country itself. The chief of these, as I've already observed, was Perrin. His condition and that of his party was such that they were determined at all hazards to insist that the cognizance of all matters of discipline should be transferred from the presbytery to the state, rather to the Senate, which is the state. The presbytery, on the contrary, maintained that the laws enacted relative to ecclesiastical discipline were agreeable to the word of God, and therefore implored the assistance of the Senate to prevent the church from suffering harm. The Senate decided that the ecclesiastical laws were to be enforced, and passed an enactment to that effect. At last, Perrin, having by his audacity brought himself into the greatest jeopardy, the result of the whole affair was that he was expelled from the Senate and deprived of his office of captain, and reduced to the rank of private citizen. But though all these things were transacted in an open court, it is impossible to describe the trouble which they gave to Calvin. Indeed, on one occasion, in the court of the 200, the quarrel rose to such a height that they were on the point of drawing their swords and staining the court itself with mutual slaughter. During the disturbance, Calvin, coming in with his colleagues, suppressed it at the risk of his life, as the factious proceedings of these men were directed specially against him. He proceeded, nevertheless, to express his utter detestation of their crimes, and rebuked them with the severity which they deserved. Nor did his denunciation of divine judgment prove vain, for about this time, one of them having been detected to have written and to have fixed to the pulpit an infamous libel, in which, along with many nefarious attacks on the sacred ministry, it was said that Calvin ought to be thrown headlong into the Rhone, was after due investigation unexpectedly found guilty of an infinite number of other blasphemies and punished with death. Nay, after his execution, a book was found in his own handwriting, expressly attacking Moses and even Christ himself. It moreover appeared that he had succeeded in infecting others with his horrid impiety. In this year, amid all these contentions, Calvin wrote his antidote to the 7 sessions of the so-called Council of Trent, and also by letter confirmed the Church of Rouen. It's R-O-U-E-N, not R-U-I-N. Subtle difference, I suppose. In opposition to the fraudulent proceedings of a certain Franciscan who had begun to spread the poisonous errors of Carpocrates as renewed by the libertines. In the following year, that's 1548, the old factions again burst forth. Satan, for that purpose, the thing is almost incredible, making use especially of the very persons who were most desirous of suppressing it, Farel and Viret. They, having arrived at Geneva at the beginning of the year, had delivered formal addresses in the Senate with a view to the settlement of the prevailing dissensions, Calvin merely insisting on a reformation of manners, while Perrin and his party were willing to make any concession for the purpose of reinstating him to his former situation. This time everything appeared settled, But the results shortly proved that these good men had merely been duped. Perrin being restored, the malignity of the wicked rose to such a height that some of them openly used collars cut into the form of a cross for the purpose of mutual recognition, while others gave the name of Calvin to their dogs, which to me doesn't seem offensive, but I suppose in this day it would, or playing upon the name, changed Calvin into Cain. Finally, not a few, from enmity to him, declared that they would not join in the Lord's Supper. All these proceedings were sharply rebuked by him and his colleagues, and the parties being brought before the Senate, the good cause easily prevailed. Ultimately, on the 18th of December, the amnesty was again ratified by solemn oath, but in Perrin and his party, all these things were mere pretense, their only object being, as the event proved, to procure the syndicate for him, and so furnish them with the means of doing more mischief. During all this strife, not only was Calvin not idle, but, as if he had been living in retirement, wrote most learned commentaries on 6 of Paul's epistles, and in a most solid treatise refuted what is called the Interim, which had been published for the purpose of corrupting the German churches, and pointed out the true method of renewing the church. Lastly, in a very elegant little treatise, he exposed the falsehood and vanity of what is called judicial astrology. Judicial astrology, no idea what that is, in which not a few seem to put too much faith. At this time, also having been written to by Brentius, who was living in exile in Basel, he returned an answer condoling with him in the most friendly terms. I wish Brentius had continued this connection. He also wrote to Bucer, who was then in exile in England, candidly exhorting him to write and speak more clearly on the subject of the Lord's Supper, and at the same time expressing the greatest sympathy with him. At the same time, in a carefully written letter addressed to the Duke of Somerset, protector of England, who was afterwards most unjustly put to death, he gave a warning which, if it had been duly attended to, might perhaps have enabled the Church of England to escape many storms. During these contests, the Church of Geneva wonderfully increased. This, as it exceedingly vexed Satan and the wicked, so it put Calvin in greater spirits to entertain those who were living in exile for the cause of Christ. His anxiety on this head was so favored of the Lord in the following year that the rage of the wicked, though not altogether extinguished, seemed at least to be temporarily suppressed. And in truth he stood in need of a truce, the more especially that he had sustained a grievous domestic calamity in the death of his most excellent wife. This affliction he bore with a firmness which made him in this respect also a shining example to the whole church. In this year, 1549, a dispute having arisen in the Saxon churches concerning matters of indifference, called diaphora. Calvin, being asked for his advice, gave a candid statement of his sentiments to Philip Melanchthon, and at the same time reminded him of his duty. Now, some accused Melanchthon of being too easy in this matter, but undeservedly, as Calvin was afterwards convinced on more accurate information. For it was not known at the time what was the spirit which animated the evil genius of Flacius and his whole tribe, who afterwards produced such disturbances, and even now impede the work of the Lord, assuredly with no less impudence and fury than if they were actually in the pay of the Roman pontiff. But the wound thus inflicted on the German churches the Lord compensated, on the other hand, by his kindness to the Swiss. Some having thought Calvin was countenancing the doctrine of consubstantiation, he and Farel set out together for Zurich in order to give a full explanation of the matter, and settle it with common consent of all the Swiss churches. Good men and those who loved truth had no difficulty in coming to an agreement, and accordingly a confession was drawn up with the perfect approbation of all the Swiss and Rhetian churches. This confession knit Bullinger and Calvin and the churches of Zurich and Geneva in the closest ties. It is the confession we all still hold, and I hope will, with the favor of God, continue to hold even to the end. This year, when compared with others, passed away happily, and I have the greater pleasure in remembering it because it was that in which I first entered my ministerial functions in consequence of a call given to me by the Church of Lausanne, and urge on my acceptance by Calvin. About this time, Calvin wrote two very learned letters to Laelius Socinius of Siena, who long lived in Zurich and ultimately died there. From these letters, anyone will easily discern what the temper of that man was. Obviously that of an academic, although it was long, indeed not till after his death, before the fact was fully established. He had traveled over the churches and imposed on all their most learned men, more especially Melanchthon, Calvin, Joachim Camerarius, and who, in his life of Melanchthon, bears very honorable testimony to him, contrary to his deserts. It was afterwards discovered that he was the chief author of the Bellion Farrago, of which we will speak in its own place, and favored the mad dogmas of Servetus, Castellio, and Ochin. In his commentary on the celebrated first chapter of John, which is still extant, he went far beyond the impiety of other heretics. The following year, that's 1550, insofar as regards the church, was tranquil enough, and therefore it was determined that the minister should at a certain season of the year, attended by an elder and a deacon, go round all the wards of the city to instruct the people and examine every individual briefly as to his faith. This they were to do not only in sermons, which some neglected and others attended without much benefit, but also in each house and family. It is scarcely credible how great benefit ensued. Another arrangement was that the celebration of the Saviour's nativity should be deferred to the Sabbath day following, and that there should be no other feast days except 1 and 7, which we call the Lord's Day. This gave offense to a very great number of persons, so that there were not wanting some who gave out that even the Lord's Day was suppressed by Calvin. It does seem a little arbitrary. Christmas is okay. Everything else has got to go. But their object was to bring odium upon him, although the fact was that the matter had been discussed before the people, not only in the absence of any request from the consistory, but even without their knowledge. Calvin, however, did not think it worthwhile to make a quarrel about it, but the offense which some had taken at Calvin was the occasion of his writing his treatise on offenses, dedicated to his old and faithful friend, Lawrence Normand. The dissensions of the following year, that's 1551, far more than overbalanced the 2 years of tranquility, for besides the grief occasioned to the whole church, and particularly to Calvin, by the death of Bucer, to whom he was very strongly attached, and also to the death of Joachim Bellion, consul of St. Gall, a man of singular piety and learning, the wickedness of the factious broke out more furiously the longer it had been smothered, insomuch that they openly refused to confer the freedom of the city on the exiles who had arrived in it. Not contented with this, they jostled Calvin himself, as he was returning after having preached on the other side of the Rhone, and almost threw Raymond, his colleague, into the river, as he was one night passing the bridge, by secretly removing one of the props. In fine, they stirred up no small tumult in the church of St. Giras, because the minister refused to give the name of Balthazar to a child which had been presented for baptism, that name being for a certain reason prohibited by an express law, a certain reason that does seem quite odd. Calvin had nothing to oppose to these evils, but strong and invincible patience, for about this time another new evil assailed the Genoese church. The occasion of it was furnished by one Jerome Bosec, a monk of the order of the Carmelites from Paris, from which he had fled several years before. He had cast away his cowl, but retained his monkism, and having been also for imposition turned adrift by the Duchess of Ferrara, was converted into a physician in the course of 3 days. 3 days, that's impressive. Having come to Geneva and found there was no room for him among the learned physicians of that place, in order to show that he was a divine, he began to babble out errors and absurdities concerning predestination. This he at first did in private to certain individuals, but at length even in public before the congregation. Calvin had at first refuted him, and been contented to give him a gentle reprimand, and afterwards sending for him endeavored to teach him the true doctrine. but either owing to the monkish ambition ingrained in his nature or spurred on by factious individuals who were looking out for someone through whom they might assail Calvin, he openly dared, in the presence of the congregation, when that passage of John was expounded, "He who is of God heareth the words of God, and in that you hear not. Ye are not of God," to bring forward free will and the foresight of works, in order to subvert the doctrine of an external decree of predestination prior in order to all other causes whatsoever. He even added insult and mere seditious invective against the true doctrine. He is thought to have acted with a greater boldness because from not seeing Calvin in his place, he thought he was absent. And so indeed he was at the commencement. But, we've got an issue with the camera. I'll start again at the beginning of that paragraph. He is thought to have acted with the greater boldness because from not seeing Calvin in his place, he thought he was absent. And so indeed he was at the commencement, but coming in after he had begun his harangue, had kept standing behind some other persons. The monk's oration being ended, Calvin suddenly appeared, and although it was obvious he had nothing premeditated, he certainly then showed, if ever, what kind of man he was. For he so confuted, mauled, and overwhelmed him with proofs from scriptures, quotations from authors, especially from Augustine, and in fine by numerous weighty arguments, that all felt exceedingly ashamed for the brazen-faced monk, except the monk himself. One of the judge's assessors, whose office it is to apprehend culprits in the city, happening to be among the hearers, when the meeting was dismissed, lays hold of him on a charge of sedition, and delivers him into custody. But why dwell upon it? After a long discussion, the Senate, having taken the opinion of the Swiss churches on the 23rd of December, publicly condemned him as a seditious man and a mere Pelagian, and banished him the city, threatening him with scourging if he were again caught in it or within its territory. He afterwards went into neighboring towns and caused much disturbance until he was twice expelled from the Bernese territory. He afterwards intrigued for a cure in the French church, which he thought would then be at peace, and went first to Paris and then to Orleans, making artful professions of repentance and voluntarily begging to be reconciled to the Genevese church. But when, contrary to his expectations, he perceived that the churches were in affliction, he went back to his medicine and openly revolted to the enemies of the gospel, allowing his wife to become a prostitute to the canons of Augusta, where he is this good day assailing the truth with whatever calumnies he can. Meanwhile, the consistory of Geneva at a public meeting declared the true doctrine of predestination and afterwards approved of it, as comprehended in a public document drawn up by Calvin. All that Satan gained by these dissensions was that the article of the Christian religion was formerly most obscure, became clear and transparent to all, not disposed to be contentious. Let me read that again. All that Satan gained by these dissensions was that this article of the Christian religion, which was formerly most obscure, became clear and transparent to all, not disposed to be contentious. That's referring to predestination. In the following year, 1552, it became more apparent how great a flame had been kindled by that worthless man. He's still going, man. Notwithstanding of his having been condemned by the common judgment of so many churches, for the mere difficulty of a question which had not been duly explained by most of the ancients, nor always discussed with the same result, incited curious minds in particular to engage in the discussion of it, while the factious thought an admirable opportunity was afforded them of throwing everything into confusion by getting Calvin expelled. Accordingly, it is impossible to describe the contentions which ensued not only in the city but also in every quarter, as if Satan himself had blown the trumpet. For although the pastors of the leading churches were admirably agreed, yet there were not wanting some of the churches bordering on the Bernese territory who would fain have picked a quarrel with Calvin on the allegation that he made God the author of sin. Their memory must have been short not to remember that this most Testamential dogma had been long ago refuted by Calvin in his treatise against the libertines. But at Basel, the worthy and single-minded man, Castellio, although it was his wont to do everything secretly, was open enough in the defense of Pelagianism. Nay, even Melanchthon had begun to write on these matters in such terms that, though he had before distinctly subscribed to Calvin's treatise against Figius, he seemed to some to insinuate that the Genoese were introducing the fatalism of the Stoics, confusing predestination with the fatalism of the Stoics. I say nothing of the papists who are now even repeating calumnies that have been 1,000 times refuted. These things, as might have been expected, stung the mind of Calvin, and that the more keenly that at this time the power of error was occasionally so strong that truth seemed sometimes compelled, even by public authority, to shut her mouth. And we'll stop there for this morning. This is part 3 of John Calvin's Tracts and Letters, and part 4 hopefully will come soon as we make our way through volume 1 in this 7-volume set.